Hello, everyone. I'd like to go over or just discuss the first set of study questions for Paul Landsberg's The Experience of Death. This covers, I believe, only sections 1 through 4. And there are a lot of ideas here. This is quite an amazing work, I think. And I think that the more time you spend with each section, which is like almost a little mini essay to itself, each section, the more you'll get out of it. Certainly that's been my experience over the years. And the many, many, many times I've read it over, I always see something new. And the points even that I'm familiar with, when I'm reminded of them, always very stimulating in terms of the way we think about death and mortality. Number one, Landsberg claims that there are two theses contained in Voltaire's, quote, "The human race is the only one that knows it must die, and it knows this only through its experience." What are those two theses? Well, I'm really just basically asking you to restate what's right before our eyes there. Two theses, two claims, two hypotheses, two big ideas about death. The first is that the human race, the human species, you might say, is the only species that knows it must die. That is, we are unique amongst the animals, so Voltaire said, in being aware of ourselves as mortal creatures and being aware that our death is not only a constant possibility, but is an ultimate necessity. That's the must die, the necessity of death, which is a very big concern for Landsberg. The idea that death is necessary, as we'll see, that takes a strange turn, I think, at least in my interpretation of Landsberg's essay. But that's the first thesis, that human beings are the only animals that know that they will die and that there's no avoiding it. The second thesis is the second part of it, that it knows this only through its experience. That is, the knowledge of our mortality, the knowledge, let's say, that all human beings will die, is something that we learn from experience. It's like learning that there are 9 players on a baseball team, or that mailboxes are blue, or that the president of the United States is elected through the Electoral College. This is empirical knowledge, things that we find out through our experience. We find this out through our experience, not through pure logic. There are things in philosophy, or amongst philosophers, some at least, that are thought of as known not through experience, that are known through pure reason. Let's say perhaps some of the fundamental principles of mathematics and logic, things that we know without having to look and experience them. Let's say things like things that are equal to each other, things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other, or the same statement cannot be both true and false in the same sense at the same time. Those are thought to be things that we don't learn through experience, so things that are almost built into our thinking already. Some philosophers have called them innate ideas. Some philosophers have called them a priori knowledge, that is, knowledge that we have prior to experience. But Voltaire is claiming that we only know that we are creatures that will die from our experience, which is basically our experience of other human beings and other living things, that they seem to die. Those raises certain issues, but I think those are the two theses. Number 2, what is Shaler's idea of death? Max Shaler, very prominent European philosopher of Landsberg's time, early part of the 20th century, 20s and 30s. What is his idea of death? It's on page 195, and it's fascinating, I think, Shaler's idea of death, especially as a person who is getting older, 54 years old. That's, I would say, the cusp. I'm on the very cusp of old age. Maybe I'm old already, and that's fine. But Shaler's idea of that the experience of death, what is Shaler's idea of death? Shaler's idea is that the experience of death is the experience of aging. As we see here in section 2, starting on page 195, Shaler has this fascinating idea that the experience of death, that's the actual experiencing of death. Like, what's the experience of going to a baseball game? Well, you describe what it's like to be at a baseball game. What's the experience of getting married? You describe what it's like to get married. What is the experience of death? Well, as we know from Epicurus, that's a paradoxical question. Epicurus thought death can't be experienced, but obviously Landsberg, in calling this the experience of death, is denying Epicurus. And there already has been an answer from a contemporary philosopher, Max Shaler, and he said the experience of death is the experience of aging. That experience of getting closer and closer to the end of your life, which is the experience of the narrowing of possibility. Right here, Shaler says, man feels himself less and right about right here. Man feels himself less and less free, less and less capable of transforming the meaning of his life by shaping his future. As he grows old, he loses not only the sense of freedom, but to a certain degree, freedom itself. So Shaler said that the experience of death is the experience of aging, which is the narrowing of the horizon of possibility for your life, which is an extremely interesting idea once you get to be my age, because I think it's true. That is, you have that experience of narrowing of possibility. But, of course, Landsberg rejects it for a very simple reason, and that is that death is not confined to those who grow old. So there must be a more universal idea of the experience of death, which is not reliant on the experience of being lucky enough to be like me, live into your 50s, and to get closer to the end of the natural lifespan. Not everybody is that lucky. The essential experience of death has to extend to people who don't experience that narrowing of horizon. So, although he has a lot of respect, I think, for Shaler's insight, he ultimately rejects it as an answer because it's too narrow. Number 3, what is our dual experience of death? I don't remember. What does he say? Says here in the middle of the page, 195, but is not death, to human experience, something other than the concept of the final limit of individual evolution? Here, for the first time, we meet the problems raised by our capacity to have a dual experience, a twofold experience of death. We may be aware of it on the one hand as the imminent future of our own life, or as the death of the other that we witness, or of which we are indirectly aware. So here we're getting into some very important territory and some very new territory for this course. The dual experience of death is that I have an awareness of my own imminent or future death. I also, on the other hand, though, have the experience of the death of others. And it's this experience of the death of others that I think really, bringing it to the forefront is what really opens things up and really kind of differentiates a philosopher like Landsberg from existentialists like Heidegger. So that's the answer to that. The dual experience is the experience of my own mortality on the one hand, and the observation of the deaths of others on the other hand. Number 5, why does Landsberg associate awareness of death with being a person or individual? That raises a very interesting subject, and it's the subject of Section 3 of the essay Individualization and the Experience of Death. Landsberg, in a very daring way, says that both historically speaking and individually speaking, that is, in the cultural evolution of the human species and the education and development of the human individual, that an awareness of death and an awareness of self, that is, an awareness of myself, and each of us having an awareness of ourselves as unique individuals, that an awareness of self and an awareness of death go hand in hand. That is, that in terms of the development of the human species as a whole, we didn't really become individuals in the fullest sense, persons in the fullest sense, until we became aware of death. And vice versa. That is, we didn't really become aware of death until we became individuals. Okay, the idea is that the two go hand in hand, and he has this idea that in earlier, simpler forms of human society, death was not a big deal because the individual could always be replaced by another who could fulfill the same function in the social group, and it was the social group that mattered. But once we become aware of ourselves as unique individuals, our deaths, our individual deaths, take on a lot more importance because we feel that we are unique and irreplaceable. So we don't really, until we are aware of our own deaths, we don't really become individuals. Sort of like kids don't really become persons in the full sense, at least, until they become aware of death to some degree. I'm not saying that they aren't important or that it isn't great. Little kids are wonderful, but before they become aware of their own mortality, they're not. It's a necessary step for them in their development as human beings, and also that we as human beings don't really see death in its truth, see the true nature of death until we realize ourselves as individuals. That's a very important point. So Section 3 is actually really, I think, fascinating, this claim. I'm sorry, seem to have skipped some things. Number 6, according to Landsberg, what is the contrast between Buddhism's promise about life and death and Christianity's promise with regard to life and death? Well, that's a big question. And I wouldn't look to Landsberg to get filled in about what Buddhism is about. He's a Christian. He's a Catholic. He's way into it. But his interpretation sounds to me to be very interesting. Buddhism's promise is to break the cycle of suffering by dying without a rebirth. Christianity's promise is to break the hold of death over life, so that they have very different ideas about what religion is for. It's a very radical, I think, characterization of what Christianity is. I don't know anything about Buddhism. I'm sorry, I don't know anything about it. I won't pretend. But I do know a little bit about Christianity, and what he says to me sounds very intriguing. And the idea is that Christ, his essential nature, is the victor over death. So what is unique to Christianity, at least what was unique to Christianity before Islam, let's say, is the promise of an eternal life and a victory over death. The sort of death thou shalt die idea from John Donne, poet. Landsberg says on page 199 in this crucial section 4, I believe, that, quote, the death of one's neighbor is infinitely more than just the death of another. Why? Well, let's take a look at that briefly. Section 4 is really the heart of the essay, this description of the death of the loved one. And that's really, I think, what he means when he says here, around right here, the death of one's neighbor is infinitely more than just the death of the other. And the answer is love and attachment. The death of a man we love with such a love should tell us something decisive, which reaches beyond the domain of biological fact. He's really talking about grief, and he's talking about loss. And what makes the death of the neighbor, or what's translated here as the neighbor, I don't know the original French. What makes it special is love and connection and community. The death of someone to whom we have attachment is a deeply disturbing element in our lives. And that's because our community with them is broken. They are now absent from us. The death of another human being in the abstract may make us feel sad, but without a community between ourselves and the departed, it doesn't have the same meaning as it would if that community existed. And communities are built upon love and affection and attachment. And this is incredibly important for Landsberg's theory of death. There has to be the experience of death in its fullest sense has to be have an element of love in it to really show us the true nature of death. According to Landsberg, why is each death unique? Well, I'm not even going to look at that. It just seems obvious that each death is unique because the death of each person is unique. That is, each person is unique. So their death is not just a sort of generic death. You die the way you live as a unique person. And that's such an essential concept for Landsberg, the person, the unique individual, which he believes is a specifically Christian idea, the idea of each person being a unique individual with an inherent value, he sees at least, as a specifically Christian idea, or one that Christianity gave the world, you may say. So that the death of such a being is going to be a unique event because it is a unique creature. Number 9, what does Landsberg mean by the truly multiple structure of our terrestrial existence? This is a very important part of the essay. It's in this section on page 200, 201, that Landsberg is describing what it's like to be with the loved one as they are dying. And he's talking about the moment when you realize the body has died. And the multiple structure, the truly multiple structure of our terrestrial existence means that we are both body and spirit, what he calls person. That is, that the multiple structure is I am, you are a physical being, but we are also persons or spiritual beings. So our terrestrial existence means our earthly human existence. That is, we realize that we are functioning organisms and we must be in order to live, but we are more than that insofar as we are person or spirit. But the big question, and this is why I emphasized it so much in our reading of the Phaedo, is whether the one can exist without the other, or whether the person can survive the death of the body. All we know is that multiple structure of the human being, with the person kind of built on the foundation of the body. Can the person exist when or does it fall? This, you can see how the Phaedo is kind of leading to the same question. Number 10, according to what Landsberg says on page 201, how are we led into an experiential knowledge of our own mortality? Suggests how this relates to Epicurus. Wow, that's a pretty big question. Let's take a look at it, page 201. I don't know exactly where it is on page 201. Yeah, it's at the top of 201. The context is this. He says the awareness of this necessity of death is only provoked by participation, by the personal love in which the whole experience is bathed. We constituted a we with the dying man, and it is through this we, through the very strength of this community, which constitutes, as it were, a new order of persons, that we are led into an experiential knowledge of our own mortality. He's suggesting that because the death of the loved one, the neighbor, the friend, shatters my community with them, that I experience death insofar as I experience the separation, the isolation of myself from this loved one, from this person. You can sort of see where he's going with this, is that we come to experience death, at least to some extent, through the death of the loved one, because we experience the destruction of our relationship with them. that's what I take him to mean right there. And that, I think, is more or less what he means in question 11. How is it that I experience death in the very core of my own existence? Well, if that existence is to some extent my relationship with the other, then you can see how. And number 12, why is purgatory such an important concept? He says for Catholics, purgatory is an incredibly important concept because it is a way to still feel connected with the dead. That is, the dead are not entirely gone from us. When they die, we can reach them through the intercession of the saints. Or, praying for somebody who you believe whose soul in purgatory is a way of connecting with them, and that is a way of trying to undo the true trauma of death, which is separation. So it's kind of what I had in mind for the questions this week.